Welcome to Funeral Disruptors. I'm your host, Felicia Barlow-Clark, an award-winning event and video producer, author, and sacred life celebrant. I'm also a funeral disruptor. I help people understand there are alternatives to funeral homes that help us mourn in an intentional way. And I plan personalized, unique memorial services. I've delved deep to see what is available to tell our loved ones' life stories and found many alternatives and options that often funeral homes don't share. I host this podcast to share the resources few consumers know exist. My hope is also to change the conversation around mortality from one of grief to gratitude. It is my absolute honor to introduce today's guest, Josh Slocum, a pioneer in funeral disruption. Mr. Slocum is the executive director of the Funeral Consumers Alliance, a nonprofit watchdog group protecting consumer rights to choose affordable funerals and avoid fraud. He has held this role for 19 years. Definitely a pioneer in doing this work. So welcome, Josh. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much. I didn't start any of this. I inherited a group of people who have been working to make better options available for consumers, make the process more transparent for quite a long time. So I came into it in the middle.
That's one of my questions for you. Is most people working in this field, I have found, have a story to tell as to why they got involved. So what inspired you to get involved in protecting the funeral rights for consumers?
Well, I was a newspaper reporter and I was looking for a story to do that was off my regular beat. My regular beat was cops and crime. And I read a very famous book called The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford. And I was fascinated by what I found. And I wanted to do a feature piece on what had happened to the prices at formerly family-owned funeral homes in the area of my newspaper that had been bought by Service Corporation International, the largest chain in the world. And long story short, I detected a lot of collusion between industry members and the state regulatory board that prevented me from getting access to public records and documents that were necessary to tell the story. And I was so surprised by this that I struck up a relationship with Funeral Consumers Alliance, and it turned into a job.
Well, so you did mention that you inherited this. So how long has Funeral Consumers Alliance actually been around?
We've had a couple different names over the years, but the organization was started in 1963.
Wow. I mean, so did they start kind of under the same premise that you began, like just realizing there's collusion and fraud and,
No, well, in the mid 20th century, there was a lot of public conversation about the high cost of dying. There were several feature articles in major magazines about the practices of the funeral industry, how they can lead to overspending. Then, of course, Mitford's famous book came out in '63, and Jessica Mitford and her husband were among the organizers of the original organization that I now work for. So that was the start of what I call the funeral consumer movement. And that became a campaign to persuade the Federal Trade Commission to introduce regulations that would give consumers the right to transparent prices and the right to pick and choose only what they wanted. And that, of course, eventually became what we know as the funeral rule, the regulation that exists today that governs funeral homes.
And what is that rule?
The funeral rule basically tells funeral homes that they have obligations to consumers. Number one, they must give price quotes by phone. Number two, they must give a printed itemized price list to any consumer, any person who comes in to discuss funeral arrangements. Number three, they have to allow people to pick item by item. The prior practice of bundling all the services into the cost of the casket is no longer permissible. Number four, they have to be truthful with people about legal requirements or the lack of legal requirements. So an example of that would be, it is not permissible to tell consumers that embalming is legally required in order to view a body or to have a public viewing, as an example.
Okay. I imagine since 1963, there have been a lot of things that you have been battling, the organization's been battling. I mean, I was just perusing your website last night and there's so much information on there.
Yeah.
And in every state, there's constantly something coming up where you're battling the funeral industry.
Well, I wouldn't. I don't know that I would characterize it as battling the funeral industry. I mean, I absolutely understand that. But the Funeral Consumers Alliance is not an anti-funeral home or anti-funeral industry organization. We are perceived that way by a lot in the industry. I understand that. What we're against is unethical and high-pressure sales tactics. We want transparency. There's nothing morally or ethically wrong with making your living caring for the dead for a profit. This is a service that people want and that many people need. I mean, I say many people need. We all die, but of course, we can talk about this later. There are do-it-yourself alternatives, um, but because this is what is known as a distress purchase, a funeral is not something that anyone ever wants to buy. It's never going to be a happy purchase. It's not like a new car. It's not like buying a wedding. It's something you have to do, not something you want to do. And it's something that you make decisions about generally when you're in a very emotionally compromised frame of mind by grief. There's a unique relationship between the buyer and the seller when it comes to funerals, and that's where the vulnerability can come in. What we want to do is give people factual knowledge, demystify this process so that they feel confident in asking questions. They feel confident in comparing prices and value for service rather than thinking, oh, I better just go along with what they tell me or people will think I'm cheap and I don't love my mother. But that doesn't mean that we think that undertakers themselves are terrible people. They're not. There's just some problems in the industry that need redress.
Okay. Gosh, there's so much there to to talk about. I will say that it was my sister, who is a former funeral director, that told me about your organization. So I would say that there are some funeral directors that absolutely love what you're doing.
Mhm.
She was one of them. So um, you talk about the like planning ahead. Do you suggest people like go and shop funeral homes like now? I have no need
Yep.
for it right now. I mean, kind
Yep,
of.
I do. Because it's much easier to make a decision that is going to work for you and your family emotionally and financially if you think about it ahead of time and you at least eliminate some possibilities or introduce some and have a sense of where you're going, so that when the call comes and the death actually occurs and those emotions start happening, um, you don't have to make all of those decisions at a time of grief. So we definitely advise people to plan ahead. Paying ahead is another story. Generally, except in the case of when people need to shelter money for Medicaid eligibility for nursing care, for example, except in that circumstance, we ask people to really reconsider prepaying, because that can be a financial trap and it can bring a lot of problems that are not apparent to people. So generally, we'd say plan ahead, shop around, contact your local funeral consumer group. If there is one, they may have done some of that shopping for you in the form of a price comparison survey. But if not, we can show you how to do it on your own.
Okay. That was one of the questions I had, was how you felt about the prepaid funeral plans. I mean, gosh, just reading your site last night, I had no idea that that money goes into was it a state trust?
Generally, when you prepay, it depends on the state. One of the problems with prepayment is that all 50 states have a different set of laws. So in some states like New York, for example, if you're a consumer and you prepay, your money is pretty well protected by law. It has to go into an FDIC insured account. You have the right to a full refund if you change your mind before death. All the way on the other end, you've got states like Florida where 30% or more of what you prepay might be skimmed as a commission right off the top by the funeral home. And although they're supposed to return it to you if you want a refund, that doesn't always happen. So, um, we think that what I have found is people who prepay, this isn't true for everybody, but it is broad and generally true. People who prepay tend to believe that funerals are going to cost a lot of money. They are not aware that there are ways to economize. And they often do this because they think this is going to be an extraordinary expense of between $8,000 and $12,000. So I better get it out of the way now. I find that a lot of those people have no idea that they don't have to spend that much. They can still get exactly what they want, but they don't have to spend as much as they thought they did. So when people are convinced that this is going to be an onerous expense and that they have no control over it, and that's not true, consumers do have control to a great degree. But when they think they don't, they're vulnerable to sales pitches that play on magical thinking. They're vulnerable to a salesperson who will say, everything will be all taken care of. Just pay us ahead of time. All your worries will disappear. Your survivors won't have to make any decisions. That's not true. It's not true.
That's a good question. Like, I'm in Maryland, and I actually do belong to my local chapter, and they do a
Mhm.
great price comparison. And I
Yeah,
was
they do.
yeah, and I was looking. It looks like Virginia has done one as well.
Mhm.
Um, you're saying that the cost like is not risen astronomically. Has it been pretty contained in I would say the last decade? Or I mean, so many things are going up.
I'd have to go back and look at the stats. There are many years when the cost of funerals outpace general inflation, but there are some years when they don't. I think it's less of a question of how prices are going up, because prices will go up on everything. It's more a question of, have you actually done your comparison shoppings? Let's use an analogy of car buying. Okay, if people bought cars the way they buy funerals, this is how they would buy cars. They would say, I need a new car, so I'm going to go down to Heritage Toyota and I'm not going to look at any other dealer. Why? Because Heritage Toyota is my family's car dealer. And it's my family's car dealer because my great grandfather bought his first Toyota from Heritage. So, of course, we'd never consider anyone else. We know that they're the best just because we've used them before. So I'm going to walk into the car dealer. I'm going to ask for the sticker price on a new Camry. And no matter what he says, I'm going to assume that that's what a Camry should cost. And I'm going to sign that contract. Nobody buys cars like this,
Yeah.
right? They're going to look at 3 other Toyota dealerships and see who's offering the best deal. None of the skills that are necessary in cost-effective funeral planning, none of these are mysterious. Everyone watching this right now already knows how to do this. They just believe they don't know how to do it. That is an emotional hang-up, not a factual one. Why? Because the big, scary death word. It deranges our thinking. It deranges our thinking. We're so frightened of death that we won't look at it in the face. But the same common sense that you use about comparing providers of different services before you decide on which one gives you the best value, same thing works with funerals.
What happens if somebody like a poverty stricken has absolutely no means for a funeral?
Depends on the state and it depends on the locality. Some states and some localities have a program to help low income families with a simple burial or a simple cremation, but many do not. What happens to those families? They either find the money somewhere or it becomes a coroner's case or a county cremation case.
Okay. That does bring me to, you had mentioned like the alternatives. Like I know direct cremation is one. I guess direct
Mhm.
burial is also
Yep.
one. Can you elaborate on those?
Yeah. So direct cremation and direct burial, also called immediate burial, that's a little misleading, but that is a term that's used. Just means the cremation and burial without accompanying ceremony. There's no embalming. There's no in direct cremation. There's no casket, no ceremonial gathering around the body. It's just simply the cremation itself or the burial itself. You can go up from there. You can add services on, and you can go all the way to a full service conventional funeral with a viewing followed by a funeral service, or you can go in between.
Yeah, that's one of my reasons for doing this, is because there is so much that people could do that they don't know. Like home funerals
Yep.
is something. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about home funerals, because it seems like you could combine maybe a home funeral with a direct cremation or something.
Yes, and a lot of people do that. The term home funeral, because that'll be new to most people, means a family-directed funeral where you do not hire a funeral home. You perform the task that the funeral home would perform, and that will sound strange to people, but it was normal before the last quarter of the 19th century. The very fact that we have a business that we call a funeral home, that we can call at 3 in the morning and have a corpse literally whisked away within an hour, no matter what time of day it is an incredible modern luxury.
Mm.
That's not something we had throughout history. That's something that's very, very recent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Many families are reconsidering, the value of doing this for yourself. It's a small proportion of people, but in most states, it's perfectly legal for you to file the death certificate, get the physician's signature, wash the body at home, wake the body at home, bring the body to the crematory or the cemetery. It is something that requires planning ahead because our administrative systems are not set up to handle it. And many people mistakenly believe that it's illegal simply because they've never heard of it before. So it's not something you should not wait until the last minute. The hardest families to help for me are those people who just decide they want to do a home funeral and have done no planning. I often cannot help those people. You need to smooth the path earlier, and there's ways to do that. But yes, that is an option.
Okay. You did mention, yeah, like death certificates and things like that. I know through my sister that Maryland is one of those states that two things the funeral home has to do is file the death certificate, although she did elaborate on that you can do it, but it can be difficult. And transport of the body. I mean, especially in this area where we live in, Maryland, DC, Virginia can be kind of hard to get over border. But my understanding is only
I don't
9.
think so.
No?
No, I don't think so. No. Virginia and Maryland are states in which home funerals are legal.
Mm-hmm.
It is legally permissible. Yes, there may be roadblocks. The roadblocks are often not the laws themselves. They're the fact that vital statistics offices don't understand the laws. So yes, it may be difficult, but no, it's not legally impermissible in those localities. It is permissible.
Oh, I meant like to drive the body from one.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. Well, that's
Yeah.
interesting. I mean,
Here's a rule of thumb that I suggest everybody keep with them. Anytime somebody tells you that something is legally prohibited regarding funerals or that it is legally required, do not believe them initially. Say, please show me that statute. Please show me that regulation. 9 times out of 10, there is no such law. It's a misunderstanding. It's not that people are lying. They believe that they're telling you the truth, but frankly, they have no idea why they think that. Do you know
yeah.
why you thought it was hard to get a body over? Was it somebody might have told you that, or somebody might have said that, but did anybody go and say, hey, is that actually illegal? Big myth. People think that when you cross state lines, you have to be embalmed. That's not true, except in 2 or 3 states.
What, that you have to be embalmed?
Yeah, a lot of people believe that. They think that crossing state line, or they think that you
Oh.
have to get a different transport permit for every state you cross. That is also incorrect. You do not have to do that.
Oh, wow.
And
That's
well, we know this, but it needs to be pointed out. There's no embalming police, are there? There aren't state police that sit at the county or city or state line. They're looking and checking to make sure that you don't have an unembalmed body. That's not real, right?
good
We don't
point.
have checkpoints yet at our state borders. So
Yeah. Good point. I guess I've been watching too many movies where they've got dead people in the car and
they've got, yeah, it makes a great Hollywood story, but it's not necessarily a reflection of reality.
yeah. So are there any other like myths about funerals that you wanted
All
to?
sorts,
Yeah.
all sorts. One of the big myths is that you can't legally have a viewing of the body without embalming. That is not true in any state. Not true. Another big one is that embalming prevents the spread of disease. False. Pseudoscience. Dead bodies are not a source of contagion except in very rare circumstances. We don't get sick from the dead. We get sick from the breathing, coughing, and sneezing living. So, there's all sorts of incorrect ideas out there. It just depends on which ones people come to us with.
Yeah. It looks like from your website, people come to you for a lot of things. I was also
Yeah.
looking at your Twitter account last night too, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of things that you dispel on there as well. Are there some things that are more challenging legally? Like I know here, I wanted to join my legislative group here, and I guess pandemic put off some of that last year. But is that something that you do? Is go lobby?
Yes, it's not the primary thing we do, but we do act as a consumer lobbyist. When there are state or federal laws or regulations that are proposed that would have an effect on the interest of funeral consumers, we will speak on behalf of those consumer interests. So an example of that would be right now, The funeral rule that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the regulation from the Federal Trade Commission, is in a review period, which means the FTC is looking at the rule to see if it needs to be changed or updated. We, along with more than 700 other parties, submitted comments during the open comment period last year asking for changes to the funeral rule. So one of the things we'd like to see is a requirement that funeral homes place their price lists on their website. So the funeral rule gives you the right to get a price list if you physically visit a funeral home, but it does not require them to mail it, to email it, or to post it online. So unlike every other service where you and I can hop on Google and compare services right away, most funeral homes don't post their prices. They're living in the 1950s. Their websites are just these places that have pictures of flowers and lovely stories about how many generations of dedicated and dignified service they've given to the community, which who cares? I mean, that's not where the rubber meets the road. So we are asking the FTC to make updates to the funeral rule. That's an example of the kinds of lobbying that we do.
Okay. Yeah, I like that you brought that up about the sort of the template, because that's the whole reason I got into this was when I was planning the back-to-back funerals of my stepfather and my sister, the company that professes to be now doing personalized services. I'm like, they're not personalized. They're just new templates. That's like, they're,
right.
Yeah. And I'd love that your website had all this information on there about how you can do your own rituals. You can have it anywhere you want it. Something that really speaks to me is like this push by funeral homes to get it all done within like a week to 10 days. Do you advocate or anything about that? I mean, since the cremation rate has risen so drastically in the last decade or so,
Mm-hmm.
is it something that you would suggest consumers, like maybe just if somebody's been cremated, sit back and take their time? Because like you said, it is that push and that rush because it's emotional.
Right. Well, there's the practical aspect. Something needs to be done with the body in a few days. It's got to be cremated, buried, refrigerated, embalmed. Something practical has to be done with the corpse, right? Mm-hmm. And for people for whom the presence of the corpse at the funeral is emotionally important, then time is going to dictate this. Mm-hmm. Right. That does mean that you're going to have the funeral with the body present within the first week in most cases. So this is going to be something that a lot of families are going to want. But as you say, with cremation, the stopwatch isn't ticking anymore. Right. So, we suggest to people, if you feel the need to go ahead and do your ceremonial services right away, then do so. But know that you're not obligated to. And you also don't have to feel like, well, I better do what I think is normal. Who cares what's normal? If it works for your family, do it. But if it would be better for you to take a couple of weeks and then figure out maybe we want to have a memorial at home, maybe at church, maybe even at a restaurant or an art gallery, you do have that time. There's no legal compulsion and there's no moral duty to do it right away.
I love that. Yeah. My next question then has to do with, is there anything that distinguishes the national chapter of the Funeral Consumers Alliance with, there's so many local chapters, like, a difference?
Yeah, right. So there are more than 50 local funeral consumers groups. They're all independent nonprofits. They're affiliated with us. We have a federation system. Our affiliated groups vote for our board of directors, and I answer to a board of directors, standard nonprofit administration. The local groups do things like cost comparison surveys that they publish on their website. They do local funeral planning talks. They provide planning materials, either booklets or in digital format for people to write their wishes out. Some of them also include things like advanced medical directives. Excuse me. So they do that education locally. Nationally, we're sort of a combo. We're partially a trade organization. It's partially our job to give service to and guidance to the local affiliated chapters, but we also speak on behalf of our federated system, on behalf of their interests when it comes to lobbying. And we do direct consumer service as well. And the website is part of that. Almost everything that we have is freely available to the public who wishes to visit us.
Does that include, I just saw that you just had a conference, was it last weekend? A virtual
Yes,
conference? I missed that. I don't know how I missed that. But
there's a lot of them going on.
yeah. It looks like consumers can go and look at the videos for that. I mean,
Yeah, the videos are there. This year the conference was a paid event, but all the videos are available at a nominal price on our site. Um, Videos from 2020 are also on our site, and those are free. Actually, we held a free event last year.
okay.
Um, so yeah, the consumer section of our site has just tons of articles on details and general stuff. There's videos on our site that are available to view, so people can take a look there.
Yeah, like I said, tons of information. Do you have any um, tips that would help people in controlling the cost?
Yeah, the basic ones are step one, you have to set the budget for the funeral. When I speak to people on the phone who are, who say, as they often do when they call, we went to the funeral home and we're just surprised at how much everything is going to cost. Or, or people who say, well, I know the funeral is going to cost X, Y, or Z. Where am I going to find the money? You've already missed a step. And that first step is you, the consumer, you decide the funeral budget. Like I'll often say to people, do you know what your budget is? And they'll say, well, the funeral home said it'll be $10,000. That's not the question I asked you.
Mm,
I asked you what your budget is. And sometimes people literally do not understand what I'm asking.
but that's good.
You have to go back and say, okay, let's put it another way. Let's pretend we're talking about car shopping. If I asked you, what is your budget for a car? Would you tell me how much the car dealer told you it's going to cost? Or would you say, I know that I have $20,000 to spend? How much do you have to spend on a funeral?
Mm,
I would say about 75% of the time, people actually have to step backwards and rethink it because it never occurred to them to set a limit. So that's step one. When you're done with that, come back to me. But the conversation's ending until you decide what your budget is. Because if you don't put a cap on it, a funeral home might just decide it's going to be whatever they want. And you're going to run around, oh my God, will you contribute? That's not going to work. So you have to know what your budget is. That might only be $800. And yes, if it's only 800, that does mean that your choice is direct cremation. There
mhm.
is no special answer I can give you. No, you're not going to get a full service funeral with a burial for 800. No, there's not a charity that's going to make that wish happen for you. We have to talk in the real world. Um, it might be 10,000, but whatever it is, know your budget and then compare. Contact 3, 4, 5 funeral homes in your city or your county, ask for their price lists and look at them at home and look at the different services they offer, most of which are very comparable. Everybody thinks they're very unique, but the reality is that most of us aren't unique. Most of us are very like everyone else, and most funeral homes are very like every other funeral home. Sure, a good funeral home will put together a customized service for you,
Mhm.
but the reality is that a direct cremation at one funeral home is pretty much the same as direct cremation at another. So is a viewing, right?
Yeah.
And then look at that and decide which of these you think best fits your needs. For some people, if you're going to have a funeral where a few hundred people will show up, like, if it's the principal of a high school or the fire chief in town, there are certain people that you're going to expect a lot of people to show up. Then the size and location of that funeral home is going to be important to you. So you're going to have to think about that too. But in a lot of cases, you know, you may find that, a funeral home 20 miles away offers the same service you're looking for, but at maybe two-thirds the cost. So then you have to ask yourself, is it worth 10 minutes of extra driving to save 3,000 or not?
Wow, that's a good point. Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah. I did notice that when I was looking at the Maryland price survey, that just a matter of miles made a huge difference in the price.
that's the biggest thing. And I think once people understand that, they're in a much better position. It's not like with other things. Like you might go to the Verizon store and see one new Samsung phone for $600. Then you go over to the AT&T store and that same Samsung phone is 700 instead of 600. That's not what you see in funeral homes.
Mm.
Literally, if you do a cost survey in one county, you will usually find a price range on direct cremation that goes from around $800 or $900 up to more than 3,000. We're not talking profit margin differences of 15%, we're talking 2, 3, or 400% difference in cost.
And is that all it is? Because that was one of the things that struck me. It's just a profit margin.
Well, there's lots of decisions that go into how a funeral home prices its business, but one thing that tends to make prices higher is when there's a high number of funeral homes per capita of population. The more funeral homes there are for a limited group of people, the fewer dead bodies there are to go around, right? But they
Right.
still have to pay their bills. So if you're doing a low volume, maybe only 50, 70, 80 calls a year, your prices are probably going to be higher. So that affects price a lot as well.
Oh, wow. So I hate to say it, it's a business like any other
Of
business.
course it is.
Yeah.
That's the important part. That's part of looking at this realistically, and I get that reaction a lot. People say, well, gee, I guess it is a business. Where did we ever get the idea that it wasn't? That
True.
was never realistic, was it?
No.
Because your funeral home's not your minister, is he? He's your funeral director. He's more akin to your real estate agent. He's not your counselor. He's not your spiritual chief. He's not your family member. Your relationship to him is not a spiritual and emotional one. It is a business relationship. This is cash for service. We have mystified this because we don't like to think about it directly. So we like to kind of pretend that this is a quasi-spiritual thing when it's not. It's a capitalist thing.
Wow, that's
Right.
a great
And
statement.
that's not a criticism of
No,
funeral homes,
no.
right?
No.
If anything, it's a criticism of our unrealistic emotional disposition toward
Yes.
this.
Yes. And that's my whole purpose, like in doing this, when I say I want to shift the conversation from grief to gratitude, because I just find, and I mean, I hate to say, especially with the pandemic, that we are going more and more into like holding this grief on our backs. And I'm like, I hate to, and death is just a natural part of living.
It is. I mean, you've got a big row to hoe,
Yeah,
right? All of us do who want to change this. And because I do have 19 years of experience now, I feel confident in saying that, well, for people sometimes ask me, okay, so your organization has been around since 1963. How much have you changed the way Americans do death?
mm,
And I first laugh and I think, you don't understand. We don't have the power to change the way Americans do death. We're a small nonprofit organization, and there are 330 million people in this country,
mm,
most of whom are never going to talk to us. Very little changes. If you look at consumer surveys over decades, consumers today in year 2021 are no more knowledgeable about their rights and options under funerals than they were when surveys were being conducted in the 70s. There has been zero overall cultural progress, none at all.
wow.
The same proportion, and that's going to continue. Expect this. I call it hamster wheel work. You have to do the same education over and over. And why? Because we are not realistic about death. Americans treat death as if it were an optional lifestyle choice that just might not be right for their family,
Yes.
right? And you hear it in the way people talk. You hear it when they say, well, I heard about your organization on the radio, so I decided to call, and my husband and I were thinking if anything should ever happen to us. Anything is ever going to happen to you. There's no if here.
Yes.
I call this death in the subjunctive mood. Well, should I ever die? Honey, you're going to die, guaranteed.
Yeah.
But we don't like to think of it that starkly. And because we're so afraid of it and we're so wrapped up in youth and things like that, in order for us to change the way we deal with death would require foundational paradigm shifting changes in the way American culture exists. This is a huge culture thing. It's not just the death industry.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I don't think we're going to change.
Really?
No,
Hmm.
no. If we are, it's going to come from something much, much bigger than the question of how we do funerals. It's going to be a complete reevaluation of who we are. Are we citizens? Are we passive consumers? Are we participants or are we simply recipients? Who are we? Bigger questions than just death, I think.
Yeah, that is huge. Do you travel a lot? Like, have you been out of the country and seen how they do death in other countries?
No, I haven't been a world traveler.
Mm.
So my expertise is mainly North America. I haven't been doing any traveling for the past year and a half. It's just
Yeah.
starting up again, but been around the country, but no, I haven't visited all over the world.
Yeah. But I
I
just,
do know generally that the American way we do death, the idea that the fact that embalming is so frequent here. This is not something you see in most other countries.
Mhm.
Americans may be surprised to hear that, but it's a very North American centric phenomenon.
I didn't know that till my sister shared that, the funeral
Yeah.
director, that it is basically a distinctly American thing, and the only reason other countries pretty much do it is if they're sending bodies back to the US.
Yeah. I mean, there's some, it's very hard. It's actually not possible to get accurate statistics. Like if you want to know, for example, how many people are embalmed in the United States every year, there's no government body that collects that data.
Oh,
There's no government body that collects that data in most Western countries I know of. But just speaking anecdotally to people who would know, that kind of thing is less common in other Western countries. It's not unheard of. It's less common though.
yeah. Well, do you think like the movement towards green burials will have any effect on, I mean, the way we do funerals
Not much.
no?
Nope.
I've heard there are some funeral directors that actually don't believe in it. They're like, nope, it's just a trend.
Well, it's hard to say. Like cremation is the biggest trend, and there's no stopping that. Cremation goes in one direction. Once a family switches over from burial to cremation, it's always cremation afterwards.
Mm,
Um, but the question of so things like green burial and home funerals, we're all for these things. We want these options to be available to people, and we want to help them understand how they can get them. But my experience tells me that it's going to remain a small percentage of people. I don't see, for example, green burial becoming the dominant choice in the United States. And why? Well, a couple of reasons. What people say is different from what people do.
mhm,
People say that they want green burial. They say that they want something personalized. They say that this is interesting to them, but their actions show what they actually do. And when the rubber meets the road, most people go for convenience.
mm,
So, no, most of them are not going to spend a lot of their time to establish a local green cemetery and go through all of that. They're going to pick the option that's already there, which is cremation. It may grow, and I might be wrong about this, but no, I don't think it's going to fundamentally alter. I think cremation is going to remain the dominant choice for people.
mhm. I mean, that kind of brings me to some of the other alternatives that are now out the last few years. I call it aquamation. I know there's a technical name to it. And that the recompose. Do you have any thoughts about either of those?
Yeah, and in fact, we had a presentation on both alkaline hydrolysis, which is what you called aquamation. And for those who haven't heard of this before, I'm just going to give it to you in the candid, straight language. It's dissolving the body in something like lye.
Mhm.
Okay, it's a caustic base liquid, base as opposed to an acid, right? Um, and oh my goodness, oh how horrible! You would have been saying, "Oh my goodness, oh how horrible" in 1872 when the first crematory was built in Washington, Pennsylvania. And as a matter of fact, people did. They literally showed up with pitchforks.
Oh, wow.
Yes, a literal pitchfork mob, right?
Wow.
Our ideas about what's dignified and appropriate are arbitrary. They're not connected to anything. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying they are arbitrary. They're emotional and arbitrary. Um, People thought cremation was the most how could you put a human being in an oven and burn them? Would be what the 19th century mind would say to cremation. Now almost everybody thinks it's normal. Same thing with alkaline hydrolysis, I think is going to happen. So alkaline hydrolysis, some people call it water cremation. It's similar insofar as the body goes into a vessel, an enclosed container. It takes a few hours, and what comes back, what's left is bone remains, which can be pulverized and given back to the family, just like cremated remains. From what we've heard from funeral homes that offer this, at least half and sometimes a majority of families choosing cremation will choose the alkaline hydrolysis method. So I can imagine that alkaline hydrolysis might make serious inroads into traditional flame cremation. That does strike me as plausible. Um, but things like Recompose, which is the brand name of what is just composting the human body. We had Anna Swenson of Recompose, which is a funeral facility in Seattle, Washington. There are only 2 in the country. Both are in the state of Washington. It is not widely available. I do not know if it will be widely available, but that is another option. Yes. I think that will probably remain limited in its appeal to a smaller demographic, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I know that one appeals to me. I'm an animal lover. I'm like, feed me to the bears. I don't care. I don't care if I'm gone. Yeah, gosh, I mean, I could talk to you all day, and I know you're busy. So, is there anything else you want to share? Share membership,
Yeah, well, I would just say, if these are questions that are interesting to you, and if you want to get a handle on death planning for yourself, for your family, take a look at our website. Go to funerals.org, click on consumers. Be sure to check our directory, see if there's a local FCA near you, because if there is, they've probably done a lot of this comparison shopping for you, and they're going to be a good ally as you get your plans together. And we have just, hundreds of articles and blog posts that explain cremation, explain burial, explain financing funerals, explain what your legal rights are. It's all written in very straightforward, plain language. So check that out there. And, the sooner you do, the easier the decision is going to be for you to carry out when the time comes. But believe it or not, well, you know what? The people watching this will probably believe it, because the people watching this are already, they're already indicating that they're okay with talking about death. But if there are any lingering fears or anxieties, I almost always find that the more you learn about this, the more those anxieties go away.
Yeah, that definitely, like Funeral Consumers Alliance helped me kind of move from my sister and my stepfather into a very realistic, I tried to save her for 25 years and couldn't. And I think that's what created the shift in me, was reading all of this stuff and just coming to that realization of it's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen, but be prepared. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for being a guest. It literally is an honor to have you join me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share what we know with the people who listen. So thanks for having us on.
Thank you.
Take good care.
The privilege of our lifetime is being exactly who we are designed to be, and our life legacy should be honored and shared at the end. I'm inspired to share this information so you have the ability to share your unique story and those of your loved ones in any desire you choose. To guide you, find my 2 end-of-life planning workbooks covering options in the death positive movement on Amazon. You can also download a free extensive executor checklist from my website covering details from what to do immediately following a death to military service to handling taxes. My website is celebratingthedash.com. Every life should be celebrated for how we lived the years between birth and death. And please check out funeral.org, because there's tons of information there. And I thank you for listening.